Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for being here. I'm Luis Bettoni, and it's a great pleasure to present this paper today. It's a joint work with my advisor, Marcelo Santos, also from INSPER. The paper is called Public Sector Employment and Aggregate Fluctuations. If you have any doubt during the presentation, please feel free to interrupt me. Okay, and of course, all the comments and suggestions are more than welcome. Okay, so let me begin with some motivation. In particular, let me present two main stylized facts about public sector jobs. Okay, so in several countries, public sector is large. So in the sense that it represents a large share of labor force. Okay, and also public sector predominantly hires more skilled and more experienced workers. Okay, so these two facts together, they suggest that public sector might have some implications over labor market. In particular, it can affect vacancy creation in the private sector and affect also the searching decisions of workers. Okay, so what we are going to do in this paper is to consider a search and matching model that incorporates these facts in order to study how public sector employment affects private sector employment and labor market volatility. Okay, so before jumping in further details and on the main mechanism behind this relationship, let me present some cross-country suggestive evidence of this relationship. Okay, so here we have the share of public sector employment and some measure of labor market volatility. We have data for a large set of developing and advanced economies from the 80s up to 2018. Okay, here we are going to think in volatility in terms of the standard deviation of first here on the left, private sector employment, and on the right, in terms of unemployment. Okay, so on the horizontal axis here, we have the share of public sector employment over total employment. And in the vertical axis, we have these measures of volatility. Okay, so these graphs, they suggest that they show that the higher the size of the public sector, the higher the labor market volatility. Okay, of course, we don't want to claim any causality from here. We just want to take these figures as a suggestion that it seems to be a positive relationship between the size of public sector and labor market volatility. Okay, so now let me bring some Brazilian data in order to show you the differences between private and public sector. Okay, so first here in this graph, we have the transition of workers from private to public sector by age. Okay, and we can see that these transitions, they increase by age, right? But further than that, the share of transitions and this relationship is stronger for workers with college degree or more. Okay, which is what we can see here in this black line. Okay, then in the second graph here, we have the average job tenure for each sector, and we can see that for any given age, workers in the public sector have on average higher tenure. Okay, and this gap, it's increasing on age. Okay, then in the third graph, we have the distribution of workers by education for each sector. Okay, and we can see that workers in the public sector, they're mostly concentrated at the right end of the skill distribution. Okay, in particular, we can see that the share of workers in the public sector with 11 years of education or more is much higher than in the private sector, right? That's what's shown here. And of course, this higher concentration in the top of the skill distribution have implications for the income distribution as well, right? So here in the fourth graph, you can see these. We have the distribution of workers by income quintile, and we can see that public sector workers are mostly concentrated in the top quintiles as well, okay? So what these figures suggest, what they show is that not only workers in the public sector have more experience and more skill, but also the transition of workers coming from private sector is increasing on age or experience and skills. Okay, so now let me be a little bit more precise about what we do here. So we develop a search and matching model with risk-averse agents as in Andolfato 1996. So individuals would have preferences for consumption smoothing. They're organized into families that pose their idiosyncratic risks. We have private and public sector jobs. Okay, the search is direct. So markets are segmented by the level of human capital. Uh, and we are considering here that vacancy creation in the public sector is exogenous. I'll come back to these in a moment. And we are assuming that the government is going to hire these public sector workers in order to produce a public good that is provided for free for the families and it's non-rival with the good provided by the private sector. Okay. Moreover, we have on the job human capital accumulation and off the job depreciation. Okay, so meaning that on average, individuals accumulate human capital and become more productive when they are employed. Okay, and the lifespan, we are also assuming that this is uncertain for workers. Okay, so we are going to calibrate this model to be consistent with Brazilian economy. In particular, we are going to use the earnings profile in each sector, and we are going to target the distribution of civil servants by income quintile in order the to replicate what we observe in the data. Okay. Uh, so then we use this model to evaluate the employment response to an anticipated productivity shock. Okay, so we evaluate these for this benchmark economy, which is the one calibrated to the data that I just described. But then we also do the same exercise for a counterfactual economy, which presents a different hiring policy. In particular, in this counterfactual economy, we are going to allow for a more uniform distribution of workers in the public sector. Okay, so the distribution is not going to be so much less. It's going to be less concentrated at the right end of the skills distribution. Okay, and then we also consider another exercise in which we shut down the human capital channel in order to evaluate the importance of these mechanisms. Okay, so a brief preview of our main findings. So we find that the public sector employment, and in particular this selection from public sector, has sizable impact on job creation and labor market volatility. When we compare the benchmark economy, which features this selection, this concentration at the right end of the skill distribution, we observe that the fall in employment is almost 30% larger than in the counterfactual economy in which the distribution is more uniform. Okay. Then we also find that human capital accumulation is the key ingredient behind our results. And the main intuition here is that from the firm's perspective, hiring a worker is like an investment activity in which the costs are paid up front, but the flow of benefits from forming a match, they are spread over time. They accrue gradually for the firms. Okay, so if the flow into the public sector increases with human capital, then this hiring policy from the public sector decreases the net benefit of a match for the firm. Okay, so it would affect the vacancy creation from the private sector firms, and then because of this, it would increase the responsiveness of labor market tightness to shocks. Okay, so we relate to a large literature studying the implications of public sector employment on labor market. But for sake of time, I'll have to skip this. I just want to emphasize our main contribution here. They're mainly twofold. Number one, we study the role of on-the-job human capital accumulation as a channel behind this relationship. Okay, and further than that, we focus on the implications of the hiring policy from the government instead of wage premium or the stability. Okay, so now let me present the main features of the model. I don't spend much time here. I just want to bring the main features that I think might be important for you to have a better understanding about what's going on and about our mechanism. Okay, so as I said, these individuals are organized into families. So they are going to pull, these families are going to pull all their members' idiosyncratic shocks. So the preferences of these families uh, are given by these functions. So their utility is going to depend on the consumption of the private sector good and also from this public good. Okay, and the budget constraint is quite standard. So it entails that whatever is consumed plus what is saved must be equal to last time savings plus total members' labor income plus the profits from the firms that are owned by this family. Okay, these individuals, they can either work in a job in the private or in the public sector, or they can be non-employed. Depending on where they are, their earnings is going to be different. So for instance, if they're in the public sector, their earnings is going to be this WG, whereas in the private sector is going to be WP. And if they're non-employed, their earnings is going to be determined by home production. Okay, I'll come back to the main distinction, the main differences about public and private sector jobs in a moment. So each member would maximize the present value of income. Okay, and these workers, they are going to be characterized by a productivity level Z, which here captures their their human capital or experience. The main idea here is in line with the paper from Lundqvist and Sargent, and also more recently this paper from Quijo et al. Okay, so basically the idea is that these workers, they are accumulating human capital and become more productive while they are employed. Okay, and they lose human capital when they are not working. Okay, and in particular, I want to emphasize that we allow here for the stochastic process to differ across sectors. So in particular, we allow for the mean of the process, the persistence, and the volatility. We allow for this to be different across sectors, and this is in order to capture the differences that we do observe in the data. Okay, so we are assuming here that the search is random, and as I said, markets are segmented. So we will have different matching functions for each sector, okay, which is helpful to capture differences in the matching across between the two sectors. Okay, the job finding probabilities in the private sector is going to be denoted by MP, and in the public sector by MG. Okay, and the job filling rate is going to be characterized, it's going to be captured here by this lambda t, okay? So now let me spend a little bit more time here in the Bellman equations because I think this is important. So let me begin
sorry, can I ask you one question? So there is an asymmetry between match functions in the previous slide. Would you mind to go one slide back?
Yeah, sure.
So there is this asymmetry. What's the intuition for that P, which I guess the employment, the private sector, to enter the matching function in the public sector and not public employment not entering the match function in the private sector?
Yeah, I would explain these in the Bellman equations, but a good question. So here we have two assumptions. First, we are assuming that the public sector is in an absorbing state. So once in the public sector, workers are not going to private sector, and we also don't have on the job within a sector on the job on the job search. Okay. So here, these captures that in the workers that are going to the private sector are coming from unemployment, but workers that are coming from public sector, that are in the public sector, they are coming from both unemployment and the private sector, okay? I think this will become a little bit more clear when I present the continuation of the private sector workers. Okay, but if it's not, please let me know. Okay, so for a private sector worker, his value function is characterized by the current wages, and in the continuation value, we have here first the survival probability, the family's discount factor, and then we have the probability of receiving an offer from the public sector, endogenous and exogenous and endogenous exogenous separation. Okay, being more precise, so with probability MG here, this worker can receive an offer from a public sector job, in which case he can choose between going to this job or staying in his current state. Okay, with probability delta P, he's basically fired, so he becomes unemployed, and the remaining probability he's not fired and did not receive an offer. So then in this case, he could choose between staying in his current position or moving to no employment. Okay, for civil servant workers, the idea is basically the same. So their value function is determined by his current wages plus the continuation value, which captures the probability of being fired, in which case he becomes unemployed, and with the remaining probability he's not fired, but then he can choose between staying in this job or moving to no employment. Okay? For non-employed workers, the idea is basically the same. So first here we have the home production, but notice that in the continuation value, now we have both the probability of receiving an offer from the public sector and the probability of receiving an offer from the private sector. Okay? So now with respect to the firms, to the private sector firms, so the value of a filled vacancy in the private sector is given by the firm's profits plus the continuation value. The profits here, the output of the profits are these term here. So AT is an aggregate productivity, which we assume that follows an AR1 process. Okay, Z is the productivity of the worker that is matched with this firm, and WP is the wages that are paid for this worker. Okay, so this is the profit, and here we have the continuation value. So if this job is not exogenously terminated and there is no offer from the public sector, then the firm chooses whether to keep this relationship going on or to terminate it. Okay, then we also have the traditional free entry condition and the wages. We are assuming here that the wages in the private sector are determined via national bargaining. So for each market, we would have a given wage, and for the public sector, we are assuming that wages are exogenous. So we are simply assuming that there is a premium compared to the private sector. Okay. The government is going to produce its good using linear technology on labor. As I said, these goods are going to be supplied for free for the representative family. These goods are going to be non-rival. Okay, and the government is going to set the vacancy creation in each supermarket, and the costs of posting the vacancies are going to be deducted from the production, and all the costs, all the government finance is going to be financed by lump sum taxes. Okay, I'll skip the calibration. I want to spend some time here describing the main exercise and then presenting you the main results, okay, in these 2 minutes that I have left. So the idea is the following. Suppose that the economy is at a steady state and there is an anticipated 1% drop in aggregate productivity at period 1, okay? The drop is unexpected prior to this first period, but agents perfect foresight these afterwards. Okay, so we compute the transition dynamics between steady states, okay, and we run this experiment for the benchmark economy that I described, which is the one calibrated to the Brazilian economy, which captures the concentration at the top, at the right end of the skill distributions. And for this counterfactual economy, in which the vacancy creation in the public sector is less concentrated at the right end of the skill distribution. Okay, so this graph here shows this. Okay, we still see that the share of workers in the public sector is more concentrated here, but it's less than in our benchmark case. Okay. So on the left here, we have the productivity shock, and on the right, we have the private sector employment response to this shock. Okay, in the black line here is our benchmark economy, and the gray one is the counterfactual one. Okay, so first we can see here that just one thing, we are thinking here in periods in terms of quarters, okay, and we are plotting these for 40 periods, okay. So first we can observe that the drop in the private sector employment following this shock is very large and long-lasting, okay? But when we compare the counterfactual with the benchmark economy, we can see that the drop in the benchmark economy, when we have this biased selection, this drop is much higher and longer-lived, okay? Then, in order to understand what's behind these, we consider another exercise in which we want to evaluate the role of human capital. So we basically just set the mean of the stochastic process in both sectors equals to 0. Okay, and then we redo the same exercise as before. Okay, so we will have the benchmark and the counterfactual economy. Okay, so for sake of comparison, here we kept the exercise that we previously did. Okay, so these are the results here with the solid lines, and then here we have the results without human capital accumulation. Okay, so we can see that without human capital accumulation, the drop is much smaller and less persistent. Okay, after some periods, like I don't know, like 25 periods, we're back to the private sector employment's back to its original level. Okay, and also another thing that is really interesting is that when we compare the benchmark with the counterfactual economy, we don't see basically no difference. Okay, so showing that the human capital accumulation is key for this result. Okay, so just to conclude briefly, what we are doing in this paper is to study the effects of public sector hiring policies over private sector employment. Okay, and we show that it increases labor market volatility, and we also show that the interaction with on-the-job human capital accumulation is key for our result. Okay, I just want to make a parenthesis to conclude here. We are not claiming here that the government is bad or anything like this. Like, actually, the government can help to improve the performance of the economy if the provision of public infrastructure, for instance, is below the optimal scale. Okay, the issue, the problem that we are discussing here is that when this selection is excessively biased towards more skilled or more experienced workers, it might discourage vacancy creation in the private sector, and thus it might have unintended negative consequences over the labor market, volatility, and unemployment. Okay, so that's it. That's what I have for today. Thank you very much. Any doubts? Okay.
Bom, então acho que se alguém tem alguma pergunta aí para o Luiz. Se ninguém tiver, então acho que o Marcos pode ir seguindo aí, tá bom? Obrigada, viu, Luiz?
Ok. Okay, how many minutes do I have? 20?
30.
30 minutes? Ah, perfect.
É isso, se você quiser apresentar em português, fica à vontade também, viu?
Ok, eu vou seguir o colega. Ok? First of all, I would like to thank the Brazilian Econometric Society for the opportunity to present our work. The name of our paper is Tolerance of Informality and Occupational Choices in a Large Informal Sector Economy. This paper was made with my two advisors, Marcelo Arbex from the University of Windsor and Márcio Correa from the Federal University of Ceará. So the main question raised is whether informal entrepreneurs are actually able to evade paying taxes. So we believe they are not, and we see these taxes or penalties as endogenous and directly proportional to the use of capital inputs in each project and to society's intolerance towards informal activities. So we study an equilibrium occupational choice model where heterogeneous agents decide to become either workers or entrepreneurs in formal or informal sector. And the main novelty of this paper is to study how endogenous taxation of informal output affects the economic results. So what we did here, we capture the joint effect of how society sees and tolerates informal production and how informal entrepreneurs perceive the punishments imposed by the government, and that punishment reflected on their endogenous choice of capital input. And in addition to that, we calibrate the model for the Brazilian economy. So regarding the literature, this paper is more directly connected to 5 main strands. First, it studies the individual's occupational choice decision to become either a formal or informal entrepreneur or a wage worker as well. And in this literature, our article is closely related to Antunes and to Amaral and Quintin. And in both papers, managers choose to become formal entrepreneurs when the return to outside financing exceeds the additional tax cost they must bear. And it is also related to the 3 studies that have shown that taxation, broadly speaking, is one of the main drivers of informality. And regarding to the third strands, we can check in the same discussion that much individual behavior can be broadly viewed as a psychological contract between individuals. And central to this contract is the broad notion of a social norm. There is a pattern of behavior that is judged in a similar way by others, and that is sustained in part by a social approval or disapproval towards any activity. And while informality might be tolerated and to some degree accepted in some societies, in others, for instance, informal activities are perceived as immoral, even illegal. And finally, several papers study the relationship between informality and financial development. And also, there are a bunch of papers that study the Brazilian economy and features of its informality. So, about the economy. Here, I will illustrate some features of the economy. And the main features are that the government only detects a fraction of firms operating in the informal sector, and the managers caught operating in the informal sector are subject to a tax rate rule that we will see in a few minutes. And besides, we work with an overlapping generation model. We have heterogeneity in 2 dimensions, wealth and ability to manage a firm. The wealth is inherited from the previous generation. However, an agent's ability is not. And only formal firms have access to credit markets. And at last, the government taxes workers and firms, formal and informal. Okay, and from this slide on, I will present the model. We use this functional form for our utility function, where C is the current consumption and B is the inherited from the previous generation. And the Greek letter is the weight of the current consumption. So in each period, the managerial ability to manage a firm.
Make a question?
Okay. Okay.
So
sure.
you mean like there's this wealth inherited, but agents can accumulate
Yes.
assets or something, or there's some sort of constraint for borrowing or something like
Yes.
how do you do that?
It will be clearer when I show the problem of the firms. Okay, but the idea we're following actually we're following a paper of Thiago Cavalcanti. I think everybody knows who he is, and he does this in the same way. In the how can I say the savings are actually these inheritance which is left to the next generation.
I see.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So in each period, the managerial ability is drawn from an ability distribution, which follows an uniform distribution within this range. The productive function is given by this expression 2, and the informal sector is more labor intensive and less capital intensive. And in addition to that, we assume that the informal sector is also less productive. Okay, and these three hypotheses were just following the literature and the SINF survey for the informal sector made for Brazil. So an agent that decides to become a worker has total income given by this expression 3, where tau W is the tax rate on labor income, W is the tax rate, is the wage of the both sectors. Okay, we just have one wage here in the model. The T is a lump sum government transfer. R is the interest rates, and B is the bequest inherited from the previous generation. And an agent may also decide whether to manage a formal or informal firm. And he will maximize this productive function for subject to output taxation and to labor and capital costs. And two features of the last maximization deserve particular attention: the collateral constraints and the output taxation. The lambda here informs the entrepreneur's accessibility to financial markets and the degree of financial development of an economy. So if the lambda is bigger, is higher than 1, we have our formal firms, and in other case, if it is equal to 1, it's the case of the informal firms, which do not have access to credit market. Okay. So the tax collection in the formal sector is straightforward, as production can be observed without costs by the tax authority. And on the other hand, the government can only monitor a small fraction of the informal production, and hence a fraction of informal activities goes untaxed. So a manager that is operating an informal technology is subject to this tax rate rule in expression 9. And notice that this expression reflects the fact that taxation of informal output is endogenous to the amount of capital used in production. And this means to capture the feature that informal firms operate with lower levels of capital to reduce their visibility and not being detected by the tax authority. And the more capital is used in production, the more visible the informal managers are, and the higher is the taxation on their output. And finally, this parameter, zeta, is a proxy for the fact that social norms impose restrictions on the government's punishments of informal activities. Finally, due to the reduced time we have here, we will only show the optimal choices for the informal sector, okay? And for informal managers, the profit maximization problem yields the following optimal capital and labor demand functions from 10 to 13. And the factor epsilon is the elasticity of informal taxation with respect to capital. And notice from these expressions that the higher the punishment of informal production, the less capital is used in the informal sector, which leads to a lower demands of labor, and finally to a lower production of informal sector. So the agent will choose the occupation that generates the highest return among the three possible occupations: worker, informal, and informal entrepreneur. And the solution of the agent's problem allows us to characterize the mass of entrepreneurs, where the EF is the mass of the formal firms, and the EY is the mass of informal firms. So the government finances transfers to entrepreneurs and workers and bears an endogenously given monitoring costs according to this expression. And likewise, we have here the resource constraints of the economy. Here we show the equilibrium of the economy. All markets clear. And the government budget constraint is also satisfied by the expression 15. And finally, the law of motion of bequests distribution is time invariant. We will now show the economic implication of our model. Specifically, we will also explore counterfactual analysis. And the structural parameters of the model were calibrated to match several dimensions of Brazilian economy, which we can see here. And as you can see, the model matches the Brazilian economy fairly well along a number of dimensions. And specifically, the model matches 4 dimensions of informal sector in Brazil and key others. Regarding the informal sector, we see the model matches the informal sector in total employment, the informal sector in total, informal sector in total output, informal sector in total employment, the standard deviation of informal labor employment, and the ratio of averages of formal and informal employment. And these 2 statistics were obtained from the ESINF, okay? And the model also fits the share of formal entrepreneurs and the share of wage workers, in the tax collection total outputs, and finally the credits in total outputs.
Just
in this figure, okay,
these,
again,
you target these moments?
Yes.
So there is any moment that you can see that you didn't target and you can observe that that is reasonable or that is in line with the data?
Yes. I explored this in the paper. For example, the Gini index. We try to fit the Gini index for our model, but our model did not fit the Gini index very well. And
the problem is with the right end of the right
the
table.
problem we didn't show in this table, but we opened these problems in the paper. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
So finally, this figure illustrates the distributional features of our benchmark model. And we see here that three facts of large informal sector economies can be verified. First, we have that formal firms are more capital intensive, as we can see here. Informal firms employ a smaller mass of workers as well as less capital. And finally, informal firms are concentrated at lower levels of production. Okay. So in this section, we conduct some quantitative exercises to evaluate the impact of changes in key parameters on economic outcomes. And the middle column is just for comparison purposes. Here we have our benchmark model, okay? And we can check here that as society's tolerance of informality decreases, so zeta increases, the informal sector employs less capital and labor inputs, so the informality decreases. You can check here by these blue numbers. And notice that because taxation of informal activities is endogenously determined by how much capital is used by informal managers, a bigger zeta imposes a higher taxation per unit of informal capital. And the increase of government's tax revenue is due to the higher production of formal firms, where we can check here. And we also made some exercises for labor income taxation. And from the agent's point of view, a reduction of taxes on wage has two important effects. First, it reduces the equilibrium wage, as we can see here, and it also increases the net take-home wage income. So in equilibrium, the latter effect dominates the former and leads to an increase in the number of agents that choose to become workers rather than informal entrepreneurs. And once the gross equilibrium wage decreases, we also observe informal entrepreneurs migrating to formality. And it is also important to mention that formal entrepreneurs can scale their production up as the labor become cheaper than before. So informality decreases, and finally we can check that the level of government revenue is decreasing despite the increase of the tax base in question, because we can check that formal production increases after a reduction of the labor income tax. Now, this table in turn presents the effects of changes in the taxation of formal outputs, and we can check that decreases in this taxation increase the profitability of the formal sector. And such policy change has the effect of not only attracting informal entrepreneurs to switch and to become formal entrepreneurs, but also leading those entrepreneurs already operating in the formal sector to expand their production. And again, informality decreases. And at last, we can check that there is an increase in the tax revenue, and this might suggest to us that the Brazilian economy is on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. And regarding now the credit compared to our benchmark case, a higher accessibility to financial markets has also two effects. First, more production in the more efficient sector, in the formal sector. And secondly, the equilibrium wage increases, as we can check. And a higher wage ends up making the job of a worker more attractive than being an informal entrepreneur. And in addition, through this channel, informality falls, and both in terms of production and employment. And finally, we can check that after a higher accessibility to financial markets, there is impact of a higher tax revenue, okay? And in this last exercise, where we investigate by means of counterfactuals the impact of different policy combinations, we will focus on the last column, okay? And the last column, it aims to mimic the parameters of the United States economy. And we can check that welfare improves the most under this policy combination. And interestingly, the model also fits the US economy fairly well regarding the informal sector in total output, which is around 7%. And finally, in order to complete our work, our main findings were that as society's tolerance of informality decreases, so again, zeta increases, the informal sector employs less labor input and produce less output, so informality decreases. Reduction of the labor income tax leads informal entrepreneurs to change their occupation, either to become formal entrepreneurs or wage workers. And the same is true for a reduction in the output taxation, but slightly different. And the main difference is about the tax collection that increases due to a decrease in the taxation of the formal output, which leads us to believe that the Brazilian economy is on the wrong side of the Laffer curve. And finally, regarding a higher accessibility to the credit markets, the effect is identical to a reduction in the taxation of formal production. And lastly, our model is consistent with many empirical findings about the informal sector in Brazil. With that, we finish the paper. Thank you very much. And if anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to open up the discussions.
No more questions, guys?
Any question? So I will.
Okay, so I will go on here. Well, I think there are only Brazilians in the audience, so I will follow in Portuguese. And please, if there is anyone who doesn't speak Portuguese, let me know so I can present in English, ok? Vou apresentar aqui o paper, meu paper com o professor Márcio Garcia, né, que foi meu orientador ali na PUC durante o mestrado. O paper estuda a relação entre reservas internacionais e taxa de juros, né? Então, assim, para apresentar a questão, acho que a gente pode começar olhando a parte de reservas aqui no Brasil, tá? Então, esse gráfico aqui mostra, né, a série em vermelho é a série de reservas em bilhões de dólares no Brasil nos últimos quase 30 anos, né? E aí essas colunas aqui, enfim, eu já volto para elas, mas olhando a série histórica aqui das reservas, né, fica muito claro que houve um processo de acumulação muito forte aqui a partir de 2006, em que não só o Brasil, mas muitos outros países do mundo, né, depois de assistir ali a crise asiática no final do século passado e tudo mais, percebeu a importância, né, de manter esse seguro aí compondo o setor externo, para tanto se proteger, né, em momentos de busca por segurança, né, flight to safety, enfim, e também ajuda a prevenir esses movimentos, né? Então, tanto em crises financeiras, quanto mesmo agora o Covid foi um exemplo, né? Ter um estoque desse traz certa segurança para investidores e, enfim, é um fator muito importante. Contudo, né, o que essas barrinhas aqui colocam para a gente são algumas uma regra de bolso que se tem para avaliar o tamanho dessas reservas, né? Porque mesmo sendo seguro, aparentemente, né, o que essas regrinhas de bolso indicavam é que o nível de reservas estaria muito mais alto, né? Então, essa métrica, por exemplo, é a métrica Assessing Reserve Adequacy do FMI, que basicamente ela coloca como 100% o nível de 5% das exportações de um país, mais 5% de broad money, 30% de dívida de curto prazo e 15% de other liabilities. E aí, com isso, ele constrói um número de 100%, e aí, segundo eles, o nível adequado de reservas iria entre esse 100% até 150%. Fazendo essa conta, né, o nível de reservas do Brasil, por exemplo, estaria muito mais alto. E não só com relação a essa conta, mas com várias outras, né? Como 3 meses de importação, enfim. Acontece, né, que avaliar o nível de reservas só por esses fatores pode ser muito misleading, né? Então, acho que, como qualquer modelo, né, de nível ótimo em economia que a gente estuda, é importante achar um equilíbrio aí entre o benefício e o custo de algum ativo, né? E aqui no caso de reservas, esse custo, ele tem como proxy muito conhecida o diferencial de juros no país que a gente está trabalhando, no caso aqui o Brasil, e os Estados Unidos, por exemplo, né? E aí a gente sabe que, historicamente, né, o Brasil é um país com nível muito alto, que incorre nesse diferencial muito alto, né? Então, aqui, por exemplo, nesse gráfico, eu coloquei aqui o nível, a Selic mesmo, né? Então, nem precisa se apegar aqui a esse período lá atrás, né, na década de 2000, que as taxas de juros eram muito, muito maiores, mas mesmo aqui perto, né, até o final ali de 2016, a taxa estava em um pouco mais de 14%, né? Então, comparado com muitos países, aí era uma taxa muito alta. E aí, o que eu considero como uma hipótese base aqui para o estudo que eu estou propondo é entender que em outubro de 2016, em um ambiente, né, de crescimento mais moderado, de expectativas de inflação mais contidas, e um ambiente muito diferente do que já tinha se visto antes, quando o Banco Central corta a taxa de juros aqui, a hipótese é que estava se iniciando um ciclo de easing, né, em política monetária, e que esse ciclo durou aqui pelo menos até maio de 2018, tá? Eu não estou englobando aqui esse finalzinho durante o Covid, tá? Então, eu estou falando desse ciclo aqui que tirou a taxa de juros de 14,25 até a taxa de 6,5, tá? Acho que é importante entender, né, que eu não estou falando dessa ponta, porque o corte de juros aqui entre 2016 e 2018 no Brasil não fazia parte de um contexto internacional de relaxamento de política monetária, tá? Era uma questão específica do Brasil, né? Como eu disse, por questões da macro local, e é muito diferente do que aconteceu aqui na ponta, né? Que é uma crise do Covid gerou um estímulo no mundo inteiro, né? Isso é muito importante porque vai ser uma hipótese, né, necessária ali para o modelo de teste que eu vou usar, né? Então, dado esse ambiente que primeiro eu coloquei de reservas aumentando muito ao longo do tempo, né, recentemente, e o custo de manter e de comprar reservas é muito mais baixo, né? A pergunta que fica será que a queda dessa taxa de juros no Brasil teve um papel importante para manter as reservas em um nível mais alto, tendo em vista, né, que o Banco Central estava, sim, fazendo essa maximização de um custo-benefício ao decidir manter as reservas tão altas, né? Então, para responder essa pergunta, o que a gente usa aqui uma análise contrafactual, né? Então, dada essa intervenção, né? Dada essa redução de taxa de juros no Brasil, de um patamar muito alto para um patamar mais baixo, a gente verifica, né? Qual teria sido o nível de reservas internacionais se não tivesse ocorrido nenhuma mudança nessa proxy do custo de acumular reservas, tá? Aqui acho que vale entender, né, que aqui esse custo é incorrido nesse ambiente do Brasil, tendo em vista que essa acumulação de reservas não é oriunda de sucessivos superávites em conta corrente, em conta, enfim, no balanço de pagamentos. Ele vem de fato de uma acumulação ativa, né, em que o Banco Central emitia dívida para financiar essa compra de dólares, tá? Então, aqui, o método que eu uso é o Artificial Counterfactual, que é o método do Marcelo Medeiros, do Ricardo Mazzini, e aqui o primeiro paper também, o Carlos, né, Viana. Para a variável explicativa que eu uso, né? Então, aqui, para reservas, eu trabalho tanto com as reservas líquidas, no caso aqui, líquida de swaps e de Ripple, de intervenções via Ripple, e também as reservas grossas, né? Que levariam tudo isso em consideração. Vou falar um pouquinho mais tarde também o porquê, né? Da diferença aqui entre essas duas coisas. E aí, como controle, né, eu coloco todas as variáveis principais aí que motivam a acumulação de reservas, né? Então, essa questão de broad money, de other liabilities em moeda estrangeira, né? De exportações, ou seja, esse montante de passivos e tal que o país tem, né? Que estaria mais sujeitos a fugas, né? E que motivam essa a ter um seguro mais alto, né? E também controlando aqui por taxa de câmbio, né? Dado que a taxa de câmbio é muito importante porque gera efeitos de valuation, né? Bom, o período de análise aqui entre janeiro de 2008 e maio de 2020, tá? Os dados são mensais. E aí, basicamente, né, a intuição, então, que os modelos de custo-benefícios me dariam aqui para o que a gente espera, né, do resultado, é que taxas mais baixas de juros prescreveriam, dado o mesmo benefício, né, então, dado o mesmo risco de cada país, níveis mais altos de reservas, né, ceteris paribus. Bom, então, estando introduzida aí a questão, né, vamos mostrar algumas coisas aqui. Bom, aqui é só para mostrar de fato que essa acumulação, né, de reservas não foi um movimento nas últimas 2 décadas, né, não foi um movimento específico do Brasil. Aqui no gráfico eu coloco algumas regiões do mundo, né, então desde 2002 até aqui por agora, você percebe que tem de fato uma tendência geral, né, de acumulação. Aqui principalmente a Emerging Asia, né, que atingiu níveis muito altos, mas mesmo Latam, CIMIA e tudo mais. E aí a razão, né, pela qual algum país, né, acumula reservas, acho que na literatura são 2 pontos principais, né? Então, o primeiro seria o motivo precaucionário. Então, o que é isso, né? O motivo é olhar as reservas como, de fato, um seguro para o país. Então, eu tenho esse seguro para me proteger de sudden stops, para me proteger de ambientes de crises financeiras, para me proteger de riscos de rolagem, de dívida. E aí, enfim, aqui é importante, né? A gente está falando de economias que têm acesso um pouco limitado ao mercado global de capital, né? Ou, enfim, que não são considerados ativos seguros, né? Então, que em ambientes um pouco mais incertos, né? Estariam sujeitos a esse tipo de problema. E aí tem outro motivo também que a literatura menciona, né, e trabalha com, é um motivo chamado mercantilista, né, que é aquele motivo que a China é o exemplo clássico, que é de uma acumulação de dólares com o objetivo de interferência no câmbio, né? Então, retirando esse câmbio, gerando alguma depreciação na moeda e, com isso, estimulando a parte de exportações, tá? E aí, é claro, né, o modelo que eu estou trabalhando aqui é todo racional, vem dessa questão de motivo precaucionário, tá? E aí, como reserva sendo um seguro, tem, claro, um custo, e aí você precisa balancear esses 2 pontos, né? E aí, assim, existe um nível ótimo, né? Acho que é uma questão super interessante tentar pensar nesse nível ótimo, né? Existem muitos papers que tratam sobre isso. Uma daquelas regras de bolso, né, que eu comentei, que é a Greenspan-Guidotti Rule, né? Diferente um pouco da área metric, mas usa um desses componentes, que é justamente fazer um 100% da dívida externa de curto prazo de um país. E aí, essa conta aqui da Greenspan-Guidotti Rule, segundo esse paper, que é muito conhecido na literatura do Gianni Rancière, de 2011, eles mapeiam que essa regra indicaria um nível ótimo em torno de 10%, tá? Mas, como eu disse, é uma perspectiva muito limitada para se analisar isso, tá? Acho que é importante levar outros fatores em consideração. E aí é justamente o que a literatura mais recente vem fazendo, tá? Então, por exemplo, esse paper do Bianchi e coautores aqui de 2018, que olha para um modelo mais completo, que tem risco de rolagem, tem outros fatores, e aí lá, por exemplo, em simulações, encontram níveis ótimos muito diferentes, a depender do nível de aversão do investidor estrangeiro, basicamente. Então, aqui, por exemplo, eles encontravam níveis ótimos de 6% a 40% do PIB, a depender dessa especificação. Tem alguma pergunta? Eu vi o microfone ligado. Bom, e aí, assim, só para ter referência, né, o Brasil, ele está atualmente, assim, né, com pré-Covid ali, quando ainda estava mais, agora teve alguma oscilação, mas estava aí em torno de 18% do PIB, a Ásia ainda mais alto, tá? Então, de fato, essas regras de bolso não match muito bem, né, a realidade aqui. Aí alguns papers, né, que são comuns na literatura, né, então, esse do Bianchi é o que eu acabei de mencionar, né, tem também a questão de estabilidade financeira, né, então, tem tanta essa questão que a gente está falando de trazer mais confiança já em um momento de crise, mas tem também um fator importante que é prevenir crises quando seria específica daquele país, né, então, ter um nível de reservas alto inibiria, o que esse paper aqui encontra, né, inibiria investidores estrangeiros de sair da economia em um momento um pouco mais instável e tudo mais. Essa questão da visão mercantilista, quem pontua é esse Dooley aqui em 2003. Então, enfim, acho que são várias formas de lidar com isso, né? E aí, só que assim, acho que todos esses, né, que tratam de motivo precaucionário, têm aí como background essa questão de custo-benefício, que é o que a gente trata aqui, mas de uma forma empírica, né? Então, aí, indo para a metodologia, né? Então, o que a gente... qual que era a questão aqui, né, o problema? Quando tentando, em micro, ou enfim, tentando medir o efeito de alguma intervenção, né, a unidade tratada, né, que no caso o Brasil, deveria ser sempre comparada com outra suficientemente similar, né, que não tenha sido submetida à intervenção. Então, aqui no caso do Brasil, o ideal seria ter outro país muito parecido, né, parecido o suficiente, que não tenha passado por esse ciclo de corte de juros que o Brasil passou, e aí a gente poderia comparar o comportamento das reservas nesse país com o nosso e chegar a alguma conclusão. Mas aí, em se tratando de países, né, é muito difícil encontrar algum que seja parecido o suficiente, e aí por isso que a literatura construiu aí várias metodologias para ter contrafactuais adequados, né? Então, que aí o que a gente faz aqui, né? Então, justamente no que a gente usa, né? No Artificial Counterfactual. Então, assim, o que a gente quer, né? Então, que esse Y1 aqui seria, de fato, o país, né? O Brasil, a partir de outubro de 2016, né? Com o início do corte de juros. Então, aqui seria observar a série de reservas depois desse evento. E aí, esse Y0 seria o Brasil, observar o nível de reservas do Brasil sem que esse corte de juros tivesse acontecido. A gente sabe que essa série Y0 ela não existe, né? E ela é impossível de obter. Então, o que a gente precisa aqui é, de alguma forma, estimar isso, né? E aí, como a gente faz essa estimativa? Basicamente, o que o método faz eu coloco lá como insumo todas essas variáveis que eu tratei, né? Reservas e todos os controles para uma série de outros países, né? Outros emergentes, E aí, com isso, o método estima pesos ótimos que criem um contrafactual muito parecido com o Brasil a partir de cada uma dessas séries, tá? E aí, com isso, a gente tem um comparativo aí ideal para avaliar o nível de reservas sem que tivesse acontecido essa mudança de ambiente, tá? E aí, assim, por que o arco, né? Então, na literatura existem vários outros métodos aí para estimar esse tipo de efeito. Eu acho que o mais conhecido, que seria um substituto mais próximo, é o Synthetic Control. E aí, por que eu escolhi o arco, né? Porque, basicamente, aqui, acho que são dois dos grandes fatores. Um é que ele já tinha toda uma estrutura de testes e tal para fazer inferência estatística, então aqui eu já consegui construir intervalos de confiança e tal para, de fato, avaliar a qualidade do nosso resultado. E outro fator é que o arco, diferente do controle sintético, ele não perde toda a informação da dimensão temporal que a gente tem em cada variável. Então, o controle sintético, ele faz uma média cross-section dos resultados, e aqui a gente consegue pegar essas oscilações temporais. Então, de fato, a qualidade aí do contrafactual fica melhor nas estimativas, tá? Bom, aqui só tem os dados das variáveis que a gente usa, né? Então, basicamente, né, é interessante perceber que a média nessa série da taxa de juros estava quase 10%, né? Agora a gente está em 2%, e até o final da série da intervenção, né, de maio de 2018, estava 6,5%. O nível de reservas médio aqui na série 331 bi, reservas líquidas um pouco menos de 300, e enfim, acho que as outras de controle aqui também, com as informações aqui, caso tenha interesse, tá? Bom, aí aqui, acho que para explicar por que eu decidi testar esse método tanto nas reservas brutas quanto na líquida, essa é a principal razão, né? Então, aqui eu tenho o gráfico das operações em swap que o Banco Central fez durante esse período. E o ponto é que, quando você olha esse gráfico, né, que essas intervenções de swap estão aqui em cinza, você percebe que, dentre todas essas ferramentas que o Banco Central tem, né, swap, a intervenção, a moeda, as reservas em moeda mesmo, e ripples, você percebe que nesse período o instrumento que foi mais utilizado foi justamente a intervenção via swap, né? Então, e também um pouco de Ripple, né? Mas, enfim, acho que swap aqui tem a relevância bem clara. Então, quando você compara as reservas líquidas aqui com as reservas brutas, fica muito claro que toda a intervenção, né, a variabilidade, ficou nas reservas líquidas, né? A reserva bruta praticamente ficou parada durante esse período. Então, de fato, a variável líquida parece ter muito mais informação para a gente extrair, né? E, enfim, verificar se essas variações de fato responderam a essa queda de juros, tá? Mas, enfim, no paper eu olho para as duas variáveis, mas aqui vou focar no resultado para as reservas líquidas por isso, tá? E aí o que a gente encontra, né, é que de fato, sobre as reservas líquidas, tivemos um resultado significante para todo o período depois da intervenção. Então, o que a gente está vendo aqui, né? Então, em azul, o gráfico mostra o contrafactual que o método construiu para a gente. Em cinza aqui é o intervalo de confiança, né? E em preto de fato, as reservas aqui em log, tá? Então, o que a gente percebe é que o que é o resultado, né? Se não tivesse acontecido a queda no nível de juros, o contrafactual teria sido um nível de reservas líquidas mais baixo pós 2016 do que o que a gente observou de fato, né? Então, parece que, de fato, nesse período, tomando como parado, né, todos os outros fatores que motivariam a acumulação de reservas, essa taxa de juros foi importante para não fazer o Banco Central vender muito mais reserva do que foi vendido, tá? Então, acho que esse é o resultado central aí do paper, né? E, enfim, bastante com significância aí até o final da amostra mesmo, tá? Então, basicamente é isso, né, o resultado. Acho que esse ponto aí das reservas brutas, né? Então, a justificativa é exatamente pelo fato que a gente não encontra a mesma significância, né? Por falta de variabilidade nas reservas brutas, já que o Banco Central não usou instrumentos diferentes de currency swaps e repos nesse período, tá? Então, é por isso aí a diferença do resultado, que é exatamente essa especificação aqui, tá? Então, logo depois da intervenção, o contrafactual fica bem próximo, né? Em um períodozinho aqui tem alguma significância, quando aconteceu uma venda mais em spot, justamente, né? Que foi ali em agosto do ano passado, de 2019, que o novo diretor do Banco Central, o novo presidente, resolveu voltar a usar a intervenção via spot, mas depois volta a perder essa significância, e enfim, acho que só que no final, né, que já pega aí o Covid, que o resultado muda um pouquinho de sentido, tá? Mas acho que fica bem claro que a razão é essa falta de variabilidade aqui. Então, acho que é isso aí, gente. Basicamente, né, o que a gente olha aqui é que existe esse trade-off intrínseco, né, entre um nível ótimo de reserva, para a decisão de um nível ótimo de reservas, entre ter esse seguro e o custo que esse seguro impõe para o país, né, dada essa preocupação, né, essa queda na taxa de juros no Brasil, né, que parece ter um componente muito estrutural, né, que começou ali no final de 2016, era um fator importante, né, para explicar essa manutenção do nível de reservas muito alta aí até 2020, né? Os resultados indicam, né, que de fato a mudança do nível aí de taxa de juros foi importante para determinar o nível de reservas no Brasil, e aí, considerando reservas brutas, os resultados não se mantêm, né? Mas parece que justamente pelo fato de não ter, né, da moeda não ter sido o instrumento principal para o Banco Central intervir, né? Então, basicamente é isso. Obrigada pela atenção. Se tiver alguma dúvida, estou à disposição para responder aí.
Alice?
Oi.
Ótimo. Bem legal o teu trabalho, viu? Parabéns. Eu queria saber quem foi o pool of donors dos países que você utilizou?
Quem foi o quê?
Os países doadores de características.
Então, eu usei Coreia, muitos asiáticos, né? Coreia, Malásia, Tailândia, Singapura. Aí usei os países Latam, né? Colômbia, Chile. Todos os que tinham dados, né? Então, acho que um pool bem grande aí de países. E aí, assim, né? O método tem a liberdade de zerar pesos, né? Então, se um país desses não era adequado o suficiente, era só o método mesmo coloca um peso zero aí não para o país todo, né? Mas para, por exemplo, se por exemplo, Singapura tem uma dívida do governo muito alta, então muito mais alta do que aqui. Então, se isso não era bacana para explicar essa variável no Brasil, no contrafactual, ele poderia zerar a dívida do governo para Singapura, mas usar o nível de reserva de Singapura para explicar, sabe? Então, ele consegue colocar esses zeros aí em alguns locais.
Entendi. Então, ele faz muito parecido com o que o controle sintético faz, né?
Faz muito parecido, mas, assim, outro fator, né? Então, por exemplo, basicamente, o controle sintético ele tem algumas limitações, ele limitações comparado com o arco, tá? Então, o controle sintético tem um problema que na determinação desses pesos, ele não consegue colocar nem zero e nem valor negativo. Então, por exemplo, se eu tenho uma economia que é exatamente o oposto do Brasil, ela seria muito legal para explicar o Brasil, né? Porque ela tem uma correlação alta, só que é negativa. E aí o controle sintético jogaria esse país fora, entendeu? Então, e o arco não, o arco consegue colocar esse peso negativo, zero, o que for, entendeu? Então, basicamente,
então, no arco,
pode falar.
Mesmo que não exista uma combinação convexa para você conseguir fitar pré-tratamento, é possível que nesse peso negativo você aproxime o tratamento do controle, né? Ah, entendi.
Isso, exatamente. Exatamente, essa questão do controle do conjunto convexo, né? Que aí é por isso que
Entendi
tem que ser entre 0 e 1, né? E aí o arco não tem
Legal.
isso, o arco pode ser o peso de qualquer forma. E aí tem esse outro benefício que é em questão de qualidade mesmo do contrafactual, né? Então, na minha experiência aqui que eu tive, que eu tentei usar ambos os métodos, o fato do arco, porque o controle sintético faz a média durante o tempo, né? E aí acaba usando só essa informação entre países e perde a informação de um mesmo país ao longo do tempo. E o arco não, o arco também não perde essa informação de um país ao longo do tempo. Então, pela minha experiência, os contrafactuais do arco também fitam melhor, sabe? Eu acho que por conta disso também.
Entendi, Alice. Era somente isso. Bem legal, viu? Parabéns.
Valeu, obrigada. Mais alguma dúvida, gente? Parabéns lá para o Márcio também, né, professor?
Não, parabéns só a você.
Bom, gente, então se não tiver mais nenhuma dúvida, a gente encerra aí a sessão. Fiquem à vontade também para entrar em contato, se tiver interesse.